Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and showing your support. I'm sure for many of you, this is the last, or almost the last session at COP. So today, my name is Orko Senaroy. I work with the Asian Development Bank as a Principal Climate Change Adaptation Specialist. And on behalf of the joint MDB working group, we're very happy to welcome you all to today's session on Stocktake of Climate Change Resilience Outcome Metrics in use in the MDBs. Today's session actually builds from yesterday's session, and some of you might have attended. We had a very exciting session yesterday discussing about how do you track adaptation finance in the context of development projects that MDBs finance. And this is, of course, important because for the last 10 years, we have been diligently tracking adaptation finance. We do have a very robust methodology, which is worldwide known by the global climate adaptive development community. But over the last couple of years, we have been discussing internally among the MDB groups on how do we move from that input reporting towards outcomes and resilience. How do we know that our money is really reaching the people who needs the most? How do we know that the policy interventions we make are really making a difference and actually unlocking further opportunities for financing for adaptation? How do we know the assets we finance are actually reducing climate shocks and stresses? So these are really real questions, but also difficult questions to answer. And we've been discussing internally how as an MDB group, collectively, we can work together and see how do we take this agenda forward. And of course, this is very much in line with the discussion happening the other part of the pavilion in terms of the global goal on adaptation, which is talking about indicators and metrics. Hopefully, will become something very concrete there. But also, some of you might be aware that earlier this week, last week, the joint MDB heads statement, it talked about that MDBs, we agree to develop a common approach for reporting climate resilience outcomes and impact, and we will continue to collaborate closely among the MDBs to harmonize and improve our methodologies for climate indicators. It's a great4 for us to have this discussion today. So before we dive into the panelists, and I'll introduce them in a while, for last about 4 or 5 months, among the MDB joint working group, we have been doing an exercise to really take a stock of what are currently the way the MDBs are looking at outcome reporting for adaptation and resilience. So we did a stock take just to understand where we stand and what are some of the commonalities and challenges we face. So I will request my colleague Olatunji from ISDB to come and make a very brief presentation about the findings of the stock take, and then we'll dive into the panel actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hagar. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all again on this very important topic. Before going into the discussion today, I think it's very important. Sorry, wait a minute. Thanks. Sorry, I just need to get the ticker. Before going into the presentation proper, I think I need to acknowledge those that have worked tirelessly. As Hagar rightly mentioned, in the past month, in putting together this work on doing the stocktake of all the respective outcome metrics that we do have in our respective institutions. So sincere thanks to all of them. I'm only here today just to present the work of that group, and sincere thanks also to the entirety of the adaptation working group, which has been co-chaired by Cynthia and myself for the enormous work that has gone into producing what we are presenting here today. As a matter of history, I think it's very important that we talk about where we came from to get to where we are today. We've come a long, long way, right? It's not just the whole discussion around adaptation didn't just start today. It's something that it went as far back even before 2012. But 2012 was a very significant year where MDBs came together to actually develop the joint MDB methodology for tracking adaptation finance. And we've seen how that has actually evolved through time, down to 2015, when we had the Paris Agreement, where the MDBs also, together with IDFC colleagues, came up with the common principles on climate change adaptation finance tracking. And over the years, we've seen in 2019, one of the strategic things that products that this group also came up with is a framework and principle for climate resilience metrics, which many institutions actually built on that to be able to also develop internal systems within our respective institutions. And we've seen that how that has actually evolved through time down to 2023. Last year, as Olga rightly mentioned, that with the session that happened yesterday with the updated methodology that the MDBs actually developed to track climate adaptation finance. But then the question that kept coming is around, now that you have that methodology, now that you know the financing, you can see even the trajectory of the financing right from 2012, when it was 6 billion, and up to 2023, where we're talking about 23 billion that was approved, committed by MDBs collectively last year. It shows that the more we have actually improved in the methodology, the more we're able to even track correctly, even our adaptation finance. But then we want to go beyond that. Finance is important. They help to actually send a very strong signal. But beyond that, there is something beyond climate finance, and that's around result. What do these numbers, what do they mean? So if you're telling me that there's 23 billion committed to adaptation, what do they really mean on the ground? And those are the kind of questions that came strongly. And as a result, the adaptation working group decided that we're going to do an initial stocktake to understand what are those approaches within our respective institutions that we're using to actually track outcomes as far as climate adaptation and resilience is actually concerned. That's what gave birth to the whole conversation around outcome metrics within the group. Most of the people in this room, I don't need to go to the beginning to talk about the significance of adaptation and the significance of actually tracking results when it comes to issues around adaptation. But one thing that is very important to because of this slide is so important for one thing, is the fact that when you look at the other side of climate discussion, which is on mitigation, there's a lot of emphasis, and we all agree that there's a lot of metrics out there when it comes to mitigation. It's so easy. Get the GHG emission reduction, whether it's the amount that is being reduced, is the efficiency that has been improved, or that is being sequestered. With that, it's much easier to have commonly agreed metrics when it comes to identifying outcomes for climate mitigation. But for adaptation, it's not the same because of the context specificity, because of the differences between measures that would address certain context or certain levels of vulnerability within certain contexts. And as a result, it makes it so difficult. And because of different dimensions of building resilience, it can be human, it can be environmental, it can be social. So those dimensions are so difficult for you to be able to say, this is just the way and the standard that can be applied across geographies, territories, and things like that. So that makes it so complex to actually do that. And so we do not have that common approach anywhere to say this is how climate resilience outcomes are actually being measured. So that actually makes it so urgent for us to actually have something around this. So to take us to what we did jointly as MDBs, the work that we did in the past 6 months, which Hugo was also part of the group as well, and special thanks to the core group that helped to lead this work. So the focus was on outcomes, what's it called? Output and outcome metrics that is currently being used in our respective institutions. And the purpose for us doing that is for us to be able to share knowledge on some of the existing approaches and practices within our respective institutions as far as result when it comes to adaptation finance. And the whole essence is to help inform the work that we'll be doing as MDBs collectively, which is, you would have heard from different calls that MDBs should be talking beyond finance. Then you've done so well in finance, what next? So that question, so we wanted to share that knowledge amongst ourselves. So it was for 2023. So, but then there were 4 levels of metrics that was the focus of our assessment. One is we're looking at beneficiary indicators that were used to actually look into climate resilience outcomes. So those that are related to beneficiaries, those that are related to assets in terms of natural and capital infrastructure and natural capital and things like that. We're looking at things around monetized indicators, which are monetary elements that are helping to contribute to climate resilience in our respective institutions. And the last part was around policy indicators. So those are the 4 dimensions that we looked at to be able to assess across our respective institutions. So what were the key things that we observed? The first thing that we observe is that there's a lot of experience among MDBs. They are diverse, but we're able to see that there's a lot of experience that MDBs do have when it comes to tracking or measuring climate resilience outcomes. They may be different, but they do have, every MDB do have some sort of way in which they look at these elements. And you could see that also from the work that I mentioned earlier that was published in 2019, which is the framework and the principles for climate resilience outcome that we jointly developed within the group. But also we realized that most MDBs, of all the indicators that we looked at, beneficiary indicators were the most common amongst MDBs. For instance, you get things around the number of people that benefited from an activity that helped to enhance resilience. Those are like the common type of indicators that we had the most amongst MDBs. We also realized that majority of MDBs also had asset-based sort of indicators, but monetized indicators were very minimal. They were there, we had one or few of them, but they were very minimal when you compare them to beneficiary indicators. The other thing again is we're also able to observe that some MDBs actually have some policy-based sort of indicators that we're addressing some elements that are related to resilience, building and things like that. So to summarize the entire thing, we saw that most of the existing practice within our respective mission could be a very good basis for us to build on the next sort of work that we'll be doing within the wider group. I'm going to skip this. This is just an example, but I'm going to skip this because I already talked about this, which is basically looking at examples from agriculture and water sector. Now, so what were some of those challenges that we observed within the group? Sorry, this is my second to last slide, and I'm going to stop so that we give time for our panelists to speak. But some of the things that we observed from the analysis that we did was the fact that there was this lack of common and operational definition of what resilience is. So the question that came is, what are you measuring against? So how do you define resilience? Is it on the basis by just saying you pick the definition that is provided by IPCC, or you're looking at it from attribute-based characteristics to say, okay, these are the attributes of what resilience should look like, and then that's what you're measuring against. We realized that across MDBs, there was we didn't have that common way in which we define the term climate resilience. So that was one thing that we actually saw. And of course, it's obvious because we work in different geographies, we work with different client base, so those things are they're much expected. But also we realized that data was a major concern because data is really required, because there are some things that we have control over at the level of the MDBs, as we provide finance. There are some things that we rely on the countries to be able to provide the data on the progress of how those different intervention and investment that we make, they contribute towards building the resilience of a community, of an infrastructure, and things like that. So we realized that data was a major issue that came strongly across the various assessments that we did. We also realized that there's a lot of complexity in terms of the methodology that we do have in our respects. There were some methodologies that were quite straightforward, but there's a lot of complex elements that makes it so difficult to be able to actually pursue this kind of endeavor, because it's not just about the banks, but it's also about the country, the ability to be able to track that, because these are long-term. When you're talking about results, they're not just, they're immediate, there are some that are mid-term, and there are some that are long-term. So there are some that you have control over, there are some that you do not have control over, that you have to rely on the system that is in the country and the capacity that is needed to be able to do that at the level of the country. We also understand that issues around context specificity can be a very huge challenge when it comes to outcome metrics. So that was one thing that we realized from the initial assessment that we did collectively, and the issue of attribution, because you could be investing in a particular project and they can have multiple benefits. So then how do you attribute the one that is helping to directly contribute to resilience building, whether of a community or of an infrastructure or things like that. So issues around the attribution was something that came strongly from the conversation that we had. The other point that also came is around the difficulty in measuring effectiveness of a resilient building activity. We can see a project and say this is a potential project that is helping to contribute to resilience, but how do you measure how effective that is on the ground is something that can be quite challenging when it comes to issues around outcome metrics. So those are some of the things that we, particularly when you look at them within the short term of those particular investments. And the last part, which is also very important, is the issue around aggregation. You know, it's so easy for us to aggregate our climate finance. So, okay, this is the climate finance from this sector, you can always aggregate them and you have the central number. For resilience, it can be so difficult to do that. So, and those are some of the things that but these are reasons why we need to actually proceed with this endeavor. These are surmountable challenges, by the way. They are not insurmountable. They are surmountable with the right working environment amongst MDBs, with the right understanding of these challenges, with the right framework. I think some of these things are things that, but these are some of the things that came strongly from our conversation. So what has this led to amongst MDBs? One, it has led to us sharing more of our experience, sharing our challenges collectively. It has also increased experience sharing with our, with our partners at the countries where we typically work. And one important thing also that is crucial to talk about as a next step for us as MDBs that we'll be taking forward is that we plan that post COP28, in light of the work on metrics, that we anticipate that the work that we've done around getting an understanding of what the practices are in our respective institutions, we'll be looking into what are those experiences that we can get across MDBs that can be shared, what are those experiences that we can get with our partner countries that are implementing some of these things, and how can we work together as MDBs to develop a common approach when it comes to reporting on climate results. So these are some of the conversations that we'll be having post-COP. But the last one is around how do we work together with other partners, even outside the MDB remit, to look at how to improve our methodologies on climate outcomes. So these are some of the things that MDBs are looking forward to doing post COP28 and post the work that we've actually done. So I'm going to stop here and give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Olatunji, so much for the excellent presentation. I think you talked about very important issues about really what does resilient results look like when resilience is so context specific. If adaptation is a process which needs constant adjustments, how do you measure a process like that in a more dynamic manner? But also, how do you measure the effectiveness from a short-term and longer-term perspective? I think these are very critical questions, and to be honest, very difficult to answer also. We're very happy to have with us a great set of panelists, colleagues from different organizations, so I'm going to just introduce them from the extreme end. So we have got Baisa Naran, who's from the Climate Policy Initiative. Thanks for joining. We've got Edith Ofano-Adera from the African Development Bank. Thanks, Edith. We have got Gillian Cherbouf from World Bank. Thanks, Gillian, for joining us. We also have Laura Reyes from E3G. Thanks, Laura. And of course, Olatunji Yusuf from the Islamic Development Bank. I will start with Gillian Yu. World Bank had recently developed the climate results framework. And in that framework, of course, adaptation is covered. So if you can explain a little bit about how we're looking at adaptation outcomes in that framework, and what are some of the challenges you expect as you operationalize it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really great to be here with all of you today and working on taking this complicated but important agenda forward. First off, we're really lucky at the World Bank that this effort coincides with a broader effort to revamp our corporate scorecard. This means that the new approach at least will be institutionalized within our organization and has a great anchoring that way. In terms of the shift towards looking at results and eventually, hopefully, outcomes, a large shift for us is coming up with a standardized way to capture the beneficiaries aspect that was alluded to earlier, and we're calling that people with increased climate resilience. So this will be an attributable indicator looking at the contribution of our operations and investments in country, hopefully aggregable at the portfolio level, whether you're looking at regions or whether you're looking at the bank globally or at the sector level. And complementing that set with this idea of moving towards results is currently what we have are a proliferation of over 1,000 indicators in the climate space, because for us internally we have a requirement if projects have 20% climate finance that they're obligated to choose an indicator, but we don't have a standardized way, although we have advice and as well as human resources to help teams with these, we don't have a standardized set. So we're trying to work towards a set that is short enough to not be too heavy, but also that covers appropriately our different approaches, instruments, sectors, etc. Just to give you a rough idea of the buckets of those indicator sets or results areas, We have, and they overlap with the 4 categories, but cut across in a slightly different fashion as the Stocktake that was shown earlier. We have enhance resilience of the built environment. Then we have support resilience of people, firms, and communities. Support for governments and governance for resilience. Protection and enhancement of resilience of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, and strengthening of resilience of economic systems. So those are the larger 5 buckets. And they cut across also a multitude of sectors, because ultimately we know that adaptation issues that we need to address are usually not locked inside single sectors, but rather require multi-sectoral approaches and cooperation. So thanks. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Thank you, Jillian. That's excellent to know. I think you talked about a very important point about these 5 set of buckets, as you said. It's interesting that you frame it largely around systems, which is great, because it allows you to look at multi-sectoral interventions also. You talked about sectors, but you also talked about the different instruments that we use usually for different kind of projects, and indicators might have to slightly be different, because it's true. And you talked very importantly about ultimately this has to be embedded in your institutional corporate scorecard or corporate results framework. And that is very important, because we're not talking about parallel reporting over here, but reporting into your common institutional. That's great. Thank you so much. I'll move to you, Edith, from African Development Bank point of view. So AFDB, what are you doing on adaptation resilience outcomes, indicators, what challenges, what experiences you have? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that we're actually currently in the process. And we were very lucky that the process of developing what we are calling our monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning system, which looks at going beyond climate mainstreaming at the design stage, but being able to ensure that we can report on results, both in terms of outputs and outcomes. That indeed it coincided with the development of the bank's 10-year strategy, and at the same time, development of our strategic framework on climate, which is the first time that the bank has a policy on climate change. And the policy is very ambitious. 1, Paris alignment is mandatory, and 2, mainstreaming climate change into our bank investments is mandatory. So that gave us a very strong anchor in developing this. I must mention that both an evaluation, a strategic evaluation was done, and more recently an audit, which mentioned the same thing. We need to go beyond looking at climate at the design stage. We need to be able to report on outcomes. So in other words, we had a mandate to respond to both the evaluation and the audit. So because of the alignment of the 10-year strategy, the alignment of our own climate change strategy, and the recommendation from both evaluation and audit, it gave us a very strong basis to begin to see how do we integrate this into the entire bank's reporting framework. What I must mention that is very important is to align it to the corporate results framework. That's one thing that is absolutely mandatory. Second point to make is that we also had the opportunity, because the bank is also reorganizing how we report at the corporate level and developing standardized results indicators for all the sectors. It has given us a very good opportunity as well to have an engagement with the sectors. We fund about 11 sectors, and we've had a discussion with the sectors to look at how do we integrate climate consideration into the indicators. And we've had that discussion at a high level, which is at the directors level. They're the ones who make the decisions on the indicators. So that has been interesting. And just to mention the last few points, is that that has sort of like allowed us to look at categorization of indicators in, for example, the built environment, similar to the World Bank. So looking at assets, to what extent are those assets resilient? and how is resilience built into those assets. And because Paris alignment and climate mainstreaming is mandatory, we have to ensure that those assets, resilient is built in as a mandatory requirement. Secondly, we've looked at people as well, both in terms of adaptive capacity, but also building resilience, but as well as capacity building. Whether if there's capacity building happening, how can we integrate climate into that? The other area where we do a lot of support is in economic reforms. And we've also integrated, for example, support to long-term strategies as part of economic reforms. And also, if there are any policy reforms, how do we integrate that into the reform process? So in a nutshell, that's what we've done. We are currently, by January, any project that is developed would need to pick the standard indicators. So that's why it was very important for us to ensure that those indicators are climate smart, because they would then be picking standardized indicators. So that's what we've done. We are currently in that stage of getting it implemented. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Great work, and we look forward to learning from you, along with also World Bank colleagues. I think you talked about very important issues about having the right enabling environment within the bank itself. So your climate change policy, the Paris alignment requirement, the mainstreaming requirement, which provides you the basis for having this, and then embedding into the corporate results framework. It's great to see parallel from the World Bank also about built environment, about people. But Edith, you talked about an important issue about capacity building. And as a part of our Stocktake, as Olatunji was presenting, we did find this issue about having process indicators also very important for adaptation point of view, because not just the final outcome, but also the process that you go through to achieve the outcome. Let me move to you, Laura, now from E2G point of view. You guys work a lot with the public banks on wider Paris alignment around climate finance. Do you see any discussions among the public banks that they're focusing on outcomes and resilience outcomes and measuring it and reporting it? Any trend on that?
Yes, thank you very much. And great to be here and to hear from the banks themselves what they're doing. Indeed, at E3G, we follow quite closely a topic of Paris alignment. We have a tool called the E3G Public Bank Climate Tracker Matrix, which is quite a mouthful, where we assess public development banks across 15 different metrics. It's been around since 2018. The vast majority of the MDBs are there. And one of our metrics specifically zooms into the topic of climate risk, resilience, and adaptation. And not only with the MDBs, but also bilateral development banks, and now new members of the International Development Finance Club are being assessed. So there's a lot of information, so I invite you to take a look. And yes, there's a few things with adaptation. I mean, I think all of the people here know that it's been a challenge to increase the adaptation flows, whereas in the case of mitigation, it's been easier. We have some champions, for example, the African Development Bank, which already reached more than the parity level between the both of them. The Inter-American Bank of Development is always also moving towards that achievement, but I think it's also really important to recognize that different public development banks, different MDBs are operating in different contexts, different countries that have different needs in terms of adaptation, finance, and resilience. I think it was already mentioned that the key thing that we see with adaptation is that you can have very small-scale adaptation, yes, and then you can have massive infrastructure projects, right? And then you have mitigation, not in emission mitigation, but mitigation measures to deal with adaptation risk and resilience risks that might, target a very small community. Whereas at the same time, we also want MDBs to start moving in the direction of identifying co-benefits in adaptation and resilience. So it's very broad, it's very difficult. It was great to hear from our colleague from the ISDB some of the findings of the PDV's assessment, because that's exactly what we also see. A lot of gaps in the data, very high transaction costs, because it's very hard to attribute and to collect all the different numbers and understanding and that. So that's essentially what we've seen. What we have also seen, and that I'm very personally super happy, and if I've been talking to you at this COP, you must have heard me, that we are starting to move to a conversation of the quality of the finance, right? Of building those bankable pipelines, or those, at least those robust pipelines that are agreed and are anchored on the national level on the needs of the country. And I think that this is precisely what's required in the context of adaptation. It is required across the board for all sectors, mitigation and adaptation, but specifically in adaptation because it's so context specific. That's where we need to start moving. I think there's also an invitation now. The MDBs are here. Of course, they're outside officially of the UNFCCC process. Nonetheless, as we know, last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was the first time that the MDBs and the international finance institutions were called upon to work together as a system to help accelerate climate action. This is definitely an opportunity, especially in the case of adaptation, and we have an upcoming round of NDCs. We have the new country platform approach from the MDBs, and I think, like I said, precisely in the case of adaptation and resilience, this will play a key role because in the end, it needs to be very context specific.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I think you emphasized this very important point of quality of finance and why this is so important for adaptation, but also how, as MDBs, one thing is to look at our own investments, but the other thing is also then how can we help countries build a larger ecosystem required at the country level to produce the right kind of projects that would lead to the outcomes that is the most effective outcomes, right? The discussion on the country platform, which you mentioned, is very much, gearing towards that direction. It'll take time, of course. It's good to know that the public development banks are thinking in that direction. I'm going to move to you now, Baisa, from CPI. Of course, we're all aware of CPI's new report. It's quite scary looking at the adaptation numbers along with the adaptation gap report. So, we understand the purpose of that report is, of course, look at the inflows of finance, but then this question of how do you tie that to what is the finance leading to? So is there any thinking in CPI about moving forward? How do you bring discussions on outcomes?
Yeah, to be honest, the most frequently asked question from our readers, from the audience, it's, so what's the impact? Have you looked into impact data? And then our standard answer is always, oh, we don't have data about it. There's no standardized metrics. And we're super dependent on the data made available by the MDBs, by the finance providers. As long as they don't provide data, we won't be able to aggregate it. And that's why next year we are very pleased that we're going to prioritize discussions around quality of finance. So any things around impact, effectiveness, efficiency of climate finance. So we're going to be paying close attention to that, and we are keen to work with all of you on that. And then the other thing is, I guess I can share some example of how we looked into this, both from global landscape perspective, but also Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance by CPI. So just on the global landscape, we looked into it. We were going through different websites, we looked into project descriptions, and most of the time, as exactly Olatunji said, there's no standard metrics, it's very different. And particularly, you can find some information that's ex ante. So everything that's sort of intended as the intended outcome, intended results, you can find some information. But even more difficult is to find data point about ex post evaluation. So what was the results achieved? What was the outcomes and things like that? And I think the other additional challenge there is that the timeline is going to be very different. So each project implementation period is going to take a couple of years, and then how you're going to aggregate it and how you're going to report it, and it's going to be extremely difficult. But yeah, of course, we can talk about different challenges. With mitigation, we were able to collect some data, so things like technology cost reduction, how technology cost is reducing over time. So that information we can aggregate it, we can present it. Capacity addition also can be collected. So job created, I think that's also quantifiable. But when it comes to adaptation, again, it's all. I'm not going to repeat what has always been said, location-specific, context-specific. But when you think about what it can bring to the table, I think it's very much worth pursuing this. So why it's that it can demonstrate the results and help us prioritize investments that can achieve results, right? So it's really going to help us scale investment at scale, into billions. And this is what we're exactly missing in adaptation finance. So I guess, in the negotiation processes now, the global goal in adaptation is literally being discussed now, and the latest text was it Sunday morning, right? Yeah. The draft one, and I saw some texts around sort of, particularly the paragraphs 10 and 11 had some helpful framework around what goals could be achieved by 2030. So depending on what the goal will be, the text will be agreed on, it can provide some helpful guidance for all of us in terms of what to look into in terms of metrics. The other thing I wanted to mention that's different from the mitigation finance is that, with the mitigation community, we have this overall goal to reach net zero by 2050. Whereas with adaptation, we don't have that. We don't have something like, reach resilience by 2050. We don't have that. So I think just looking into sort of collective goal in terms of what needs to be achieved in terms of resilience is going to be very helpful. And then just one final thing I wanted to remark is that there are some emerging frameworks that is, being available. So one is Race to Resilience framework around looking into metrics is very helpful. It's very theory of change oriented, looking into pledges, outcomes, and outputs. So I think it is possible to come up with a standardized metric, and I very much welcome what MDBs are working, and very encouraged to hear that it's already in process.
Great, thanks. Thanks for highlighting the importance of having the metrics, because it does, as you said, help us prioritize investment, but also then to attract more money for the right kind of investments, both for adaptation, but also from non-climate related money flowing towards development. And surely we'll be happy to look into race resilience theory of change. I think that's an important example. I just want to make sure we don't have Roberta from IDB in the room, do we? Okay, all right, no worries at all. It's okay. We do have a second round of questions for all of you, but before that, I do want to open up and see if any of the colleagues in the room would want to share their insights, ask any specific questions of the panelists. It's meant to be a very informal chat. Shanfu, please. Do you need a microphone, please?
Thank you, Olgo. Thank you, everybody. I'm Shanfu Lu, and I'm here as part of the AIIB team. It's great to learn in a more systematic way here what other peers are doing in terms of devising or using this matrix to report on outcome or results of investment in adaptation. I'm just trying to pick up on the point raised by a friend from CPI in relation to the discussion on GGA, what we are doing. So I think it's very encouraging to see the convergence now actually between what some of us doing. Edith talk about, your, three themes, people, economic reforms, and assets, and then World Bank have these buckets of indicators. So the GGA text released yesterday talk about, in terms of the targets, there were two interesting aspects. So paragraph 10, they listed 7 thematical targets, from water, food, and agriculture system, health, and ecosystem, and so on. And then paragraph 11, they followed up with a sort of more process-based targets, talk about the different dimensions of iterative adaptation process, from the risk assessment to monitoring and evaluation. In between, there's this implementation and planning. So for each of these different dimensions of cycle, they have different targets, different timelines, for the assessment. It's much earlier. By 2025, we should have certain things carried out. Then 2027 for the implementation, 2030 there's more sort of downstream monitoring related activities. So it's quite very encouraging to see the convergence of what we have been doing and what's emerging from the negotiations.
Thanks, Shanford, for sharing it. Anybody else want to share anything? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Daniela Kijak. I'm a colleague of Baisa from Climate Policy Initiative. Last year, we worked with IDB to define methodology and definitions on nature-positive finance. And I have to say that this discussion strikes me as very similar to what's happening, what the points discussed for nature-positive finance. So I wonder if there is a potential opportunity there to kind of combine them, integrate them, because there's a lot of discussion in this COP, and I'm very happy to see that about integrating climate and nature much more in everything, in all the discussions.
Thanks for raising an important point. Anybody else? I will go to the second round, but over here I will be off script now, and I'm going to pick up a couple of points which all of you talked about. And I think it's important to a little unpack. So, Gillian, you talked about the buckets around some of the systems, economic systems, ecosystems, natural systems. And so this is where I think it's important to link the outcome metrics work with the work on the adaptation finance, the three-step methodology, because the three-step methodology requires us first to understand risk, understand vulnerability. And we have to be honest over here, for longest, the understanding of risk has been in the context of the assets that we finance, and not for the wider system in which the asset is located. So maybe it's a good opportunity that we are able to, moving forward, bring it together. If the systems level approach for understanding risk is also undertaken as a part of adaptation finance tracking methodology, then that systems level approach inputs into outcome metrics. I don't know, this is maybe a vague question I'm asking, but any thoughts either to you or Gillian from your point of view? Sorry, I'm going to give the microphone.
Oh, is it?
It will come on when you talk.
Oh, okay,
thanks.
thank you, thank you. First time panelist, so not your first rodeo, thank you. That's a really good point, and just because of the short timeline, I didn't discuss some of the other pieces that we have in play to help evaluate risk of our operations. So typically at the start, so at sort of the early concept phase for projects, we actually have a mandatory risk screening process. So project teams, they look at the country context, their sectors, and they come up with a rough risk assessment for their project. On top of that, what we have, but not right now rolled out for the entire bank, but for a subset of projects, is the resilience rating system, which actually looks at these two different aspects. So risk to the project, so resilience of, and then there's resilience through. So we have that, and the idea would be eventually to scale that up. So we have that bank-wide, but it's like any of these things, it's a resourcing and attention issue. So ultimately, that would be ideal, and that's some of the thinking behind what went into this discrete piece of looking at results for the time being. And then when we're looking at risk, of course, there are these broader issues that can come up with policy support across the bank. So how do we look at enabling environment conditions? And some of those come out in these bucketed areas. But obviously, the indicators that we come up with, they'll have a little bit of a different flavor when we're looking at investment project financing versus policies versus PPPs versus private sector, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Great, thanks. Edith, or even Cinzia, do you want to comment? I mean, this issue about, sorry, I make it very informal over here. I think it's important to have a conversation and then just stick to a panel. But this issue about how do you look at risk at a much more systems level, because ultimately the outcome metrics should be more system-oriented and not specific for a project only.
Thanks, Argo. So I'm Cinzia Loseno, I'm from the European Investment Bank, and I've had the privilege of co-chairing the MDBs Adaptation Working Group for the last 3 years together with colleagues from the Islamic Development Bank. I've worked with a fantastic group of adaptation experts from all the MDBs on also the Stocktake on climate resilience outcome metrics we carried out this year together with many other things that we have done jointly. Thanks for the question. It gives me the opportunity perhaps to make a comment going back to the need to perhaps have at least a common understanding of what resilient means. To me, you can look at the system if you understand and define well resilience and its attributes. It always strikes me that we want to, all of the MDBs, all the organizations that you see here, understand the importance of looking at results, but you need to understand what you're trying to measure if you really want to measure it. And here we're really trying to measure the resilience of a system, and therefore it would be very, very helpful, I think, to all of the practitioners in the financial system to better understand what the attributes to resilience are. And I know that, for example, in the IDB climate change results framework, they have taken that approach. So they have defined the resilience at the system level, and then really spelled out the different attributes of resilience. So things like reduced exposure to certain hazards, or increased ability of communities to deal with risks, and so on and so forth. They really have spelled it out in a way that can be measured. These attributes can be measured. And it's a shame that our colleagues from IDB are not here, because they could have spoken about it much better than I can, of course. So, and I know that, Gillian, in the World Bank framework for results, there is similar approach. Maybe resilience is not quite spelled out, but you do look at certain aspects. I think that's possibly a good way of ensuring, by having a good understanding, a common understanding of what we're trying to measure, and its attributes, resilience and its attributes. I think that's a good way of ensuring that indeed we are looking at the system. Resilience is a characteristic of a system, right? It's not just an action the way adaptation is, the way we understand adaptation. So perhaps that's work to be done next year by the adaptation working group of the MDBs under the guidance of the new co-chairs that will take over from Olatunji and myself next year. And I imagine we will want to do that in collaboration with other organizations that can really inform that process. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cinzia. Yes, please, you have a question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Esther Badiola. I work with Cinzia at the EIB. I'm wondering, this is all great, and I think it's very needed. I am more on the part of the operations, on the climate office operations, and my concern is really with the targets that we have for climate action. Most of our MDBs, we have 50s, 40s, and some of us will have an increased pressure to do even more. So in the next round of capital increase, or in the next landmark date, we will be pushed to 60s or 75, so on. And what happens in the operations is that those targets refer to the input, to the climate finance. Very often we have adaptation projects that are very significant in terms of resilience, but in terms of adaptation finance, they track or they count for 5–10% maximum. With these increased targets overall for climate finance, sooner rather than later, our loan officers, our front office will disregard these projects because they don't bring enough input finance to the target. You know what I mean? So the concern, or my question to the panelists, is how do you see this integration? We need to work for increasing resilience, but how do we work on the projects that bring resilience but not sufficient climate adaptation finance?
Great, thank you. Great question. Anybody wants to pick up? TJ or Gillian, please.
So in some ways, like any of these large, complex organizations that we work for, there's usually a Venn diagram of interests that ultimately spawn these lines of work. So one of the original ones was actually addressing this question. You know, we have a lot of colleagues who work in what we call human development, so in health and education, social protection jobs, and you know, there's a huge argument to be made for all of those sectors equipping communities and populations with resilience attributes, right? And making them less vulnerable, you know, both obviously in a dynamic space and system, everything interacting. So that was one large impetus behind this work, to try to showcase also these efforts and give credit where credit's due, and not dominate this, have this conversation be dominated by you know, infrastructure investment colleagues and colleagues in obviously what's important, you know, the green and nature space. But it is interesting. I don't know how we're going to push back against these targets. I'm not going to use other vocabulary because we're on we're mic'd up. So that'll be a really interesting issue to tackle, because I think, you know, the problem is, as you mentioned, I think around the edges, is we might actually create scenarios where we're maladapting, right? Because we're incentivizing investments in larger things, right? So with a larger price tag, but not necessarily more effective at the end of the day. So I think what we're hoping, maybe we're naive, but that with the rollout of this system, that we can ultimately get a feedback loop where we're informing those targets and we're saying, well, actually, there's more nuance there, and we can't just look at inputs. So.
Thanks. Edith, do you want to comment?
Yeah.
Just to remind us that the core of MDBs is development. For us, if you work with the sectors, they really do not have the climate lens. They have the development lens. So what we are trying to do with the mandate of the Paris Agreement is to raise that consciousness, that let's not build a bridge that will be washed tomorrow. And therefore, how do we build resilience, and also how do we reduce carbon emissions? So unless you're talking about a fully climate project, maybe that's going to GCF or GEF, it's very difficult to have that conversation around a systems approach to resilience building, because you're even struggling to get them to appreciate, you know, the need to take climate into consideration, the need to have low carbon pathways. So that's something, the reality check that I wanted to bring in. But then to just mention as well that there's a bit of complementarity when you look at environment and social safeguards that looks at no harm to the environment. Then if you include plus the climate adaptation, resilience, or even mitigation aspects, it's sort of complementary. Within the African Development Bank, we also look at fragility. We also look at how do we ensure that we're building resilience in fragile states. Yeah. So a lot of these things bring about complementarity. But otherwise, the core is development projects. Yeah,
totally agree. But I think we discussed this a lot last year also. I really don't see in a developing country moving forward, how can you do agriculture without thinking about climate risk? Or how can you do water resource management on climate risk? So in some sectors, not all sectors, in some sectors, we think these agendas are going to come increasingly closer together. And in the future, the way I see from Asian Development Bank's point of view, in these sectors, we will have projects which we cannot distinguish and say this is adaptation, this is development. It's really about one common goal of building resilience in many ways that leads to development. So, and that's why, I mean, I don't want to go into climate finance tracking methodology and all over here, but you know, there are ways of looking at these issues together and not just from an incremental point of view. But you want to add, Chinzia and then Ashmita. Sorry.
Yeah. I think, thanks, Aista, for raising that point, because it also shows the complexity of really applying not just methodologies, but really the sort of the thinking and the vision in practice, you know, in an institution like an MDB. There are so many different, not necessarily conflicting, but you know, very different objectives and goals, and therefore, you know, it is complex. We are complex institutions. We are not very simple. But I think I wanted to make 2 points. I am not concerned about target. Whatever the target will be, unfortunately, we will have demand for investments in adaptation really for the rest of our careers. The situation is what it is. I mean, the science is so clear. What's happening around the world, unfortunately, points to a situation of urgency and gravity of such scale that, to be honest, regardless of what the target may be, unfortunately, the demand for support for adaptation is not going to go down. It can only increase. And as Argus say, I see it the same way. Increasingly so, the type of support that we will be requested to provide from our country and clients will be about making their system resilient to a changing climate. Excuse me, whatever the sector or the region of operation is. Yeah. And I can say also that we see that trend in the EU as well, more and more so. So it's not unique to the global south. Yeah. So it's quite interesting. So I'm really not concerned about targets because what we see is unfortunately that trend towards more urgent, more comprehensive, more substantial support for climate change adaptation. I would add 1 point, if I may.
Sure, please.
Thank you very much, Argy. And is that we will, given the context of the UNFCCC and the negotiations in the Paris Agreement, we will never get away from a metric based on finance, because this is what we are called upon, and this is what is the metric we are, I would say, judged about. It's the language that we use in the convention, we used to have in the convention, is the language that we'll continue to use in the Paris Agreement. We will never get away from that metric, but what we can do is to complement that metric with other types of quality related metrics, which is exactly what we are trying to do in the context of the MDBs. And that is powerful because it can show that also small intervention, particularly in adaptation, this is the case, small intervention can have a significant impact on a community, on an infrastructure network, on a business, on a city, etc. So I think that's also the importance of doing joint work on how to measure the results of adaptation finance, precisely to complement the narrative on how much we spend with what is the impact of what we spend. And by doing that, we can demonstrate that also small interventions do have a significant impact when it comes to building resilience.
Thanks, Cinzia. Asmita, then Nancy, and then I'm going to Laura, please.
Okay, thank you. You can see this is a very interesting discussion. So I think it's very important to think about the resilience of who and from what, right? And that's very important. And also in terms of the current risks and future risks. Sometimes we only look at, okay, flooding is there, but with climate, for example, an area which is not exposed to heat can be exposed to heat later on. So how do you actually look at that? And I do think that this disaster risk management framework that looks into assessing risk and then looking at the mitigation of whatever you can do, preparing for some of that risk, and then really looking at that residual risk maybe through the insurance is important. And at all levels, nationally, what do you see? Locally, what do you see? What can you work on it? So I think these are some of the frameworks that can be looked into. And I would come later.
So learning from DRM framework, very good point. Thanks. Nancy, please.
So Nancy Zaitch, Chief Climate Change Expert from the EIB. It's delightful to be here in the very last joint MDB event, so well done, guys. You're all still here. This is the last one of a fantastic series of joint MDB events. I just want to bring another question to the panel. In a way, it's another risk in addition to the one that Esther mentioned, which is I've had the privilege to be in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group for the EIB and many other places where the discussion on private finance mobilization comes up, and very much the push for, MDBs should all have a target on private finance mobilization. So leaving aside the issue about our different mandates, because of course that does affect that, I do see that there is a real issue that, of course, if you focus on that in a very simplistic way, it pushes you probably away from the most vulnerable countries, it pushes you away from the most vulnerable sectors and people, pushes you towards big projects, as was being mentioned, it pushes you to middle income, it pushes you to bigger companies away from SMEs, etc. So is there, it's a question to anybody in the panel who wants to take it on, is there a way that the outcome metrics work can help balance that risk as well and help explain that private finance mobilization is incredibly important, but it has to be applied in a way that's appropriate for the resilience goal?
Great question. Anybody? Laura, please.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And I actually wanted to come back on a few things. So the first thing on nature, actually that's when we look at climate risk, resilience, and adaptation, we actually also look at in combination with nature-based solutions. So essentially, how do we factor in any nature positive investments and how you can factor in co-benefits on adaptation and resilience. So I think that's really, really important. But I also, on the point that Nancy just raised and the other colleague from the EIB, I think this is key, and this is why it's so important that the MDBs also take advantage of their added value. But not only that, right? When we look at the financial system or the public finance system, it's not only MDBs, it's also bilateral development banks, it's also national development banks, it's also microfinance institutions. So it's really like a whole chain of different actors that can help channel that finance. And of course, I think one thing that was brought up that is very key is transaction costs. MDBs are massive institutions. There's still a question of ticket size. There's still a question of, are we going to go all the way, do the due diligence for a very small project? Probably not. So there is this incentive. However, what MDBs can do is support smaller institutions, right? National development banks. And they can coordinate then with governments in order to create or support them in the creation of national development plans and NDCs and LTS that are aligned and that not put climate and development at odds, but rather map a common route, right? And then with that, national development banks play a huge role because then they channel all of that. They have the mandate to implement that, but they also are in contact with microfinance institutions and whatnot, right? So I think one of the things that can be done is really to take advantage of the different financial institutions and the support that the MDBs can provide, which is not only financing but also policy, also technical assistance, and being involved, but maybe not directly in those very small projects, but empowering others that can maybe deliver that better.
Great point about the large enabling environment that the MDBs can actually support and strengthening. Baisa, please, from your point, please go ahead.
I really appreciate the discussion here, and Nancy's question is brilliant. And I would like to use this opportunity to maybe brainstorm together, and I had some idea in my head, and now I can share it with you. So just on that, maybe we should think in terms of both money supply side targets. So there's an issue about increasing the scale of finance, but then we need to think about the market, the real economy, and that's a separate target. And then when we think about sort of the quality of finance, we can sort of frame it in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, which are different concepts. And the efficiency side of it is how well you're dealing with the supply side of the money, how efficient you are at mobilizing, how well you're getting the biggest bang for your buck, and things like that. Whereas on the demand side, it's all about effectiveness, how effective you are at targeting the outcome. So we can think of in the three Venn diagrams, it's the planet, people, and the economy. So just thinking maybe if it's something emerging within the MDBs, I wonder if you're thinking in this similar or different directions.
Great ideas. I think we have to organize a workshop early next year to discuss about these in detail. But I'll go to Gillian first and then to Cinzia. Gillian, please.
some
Sorry,
comments.
Edith
has some.
Okay, Edith, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So just on this sort of confluence of, so to start backwards a little bit, on the confluence of the nature finance and looking at resilience and outcomes, we actually tried really hard because in our shop, and this is probably emerging in the other banks as well, we're trying to push forward with a plan to measure nature co-benefits. But this hasn't been released yet, hasn't been implemented yet. But in some ways, we were trying to figure out how we could work together and partner, but that's still very much at the input level, right? So we have climate finance, climate co-benefits, and then we have this nascent world of nature co-benefits. And obviously all the issues that might come up around double counting, is that okay, and et cetera, et cetera. So when we're looking at now the results, eventually outcome space, it gets a little bit trickier and a bit different. Eventually that world, we're hoping, will also come along the same pathway and probably learn iteratively from our implementation and speed up so that we can meet at the outcome space. But it is true that it's very important in terms of when we're looking at nature-based solutions and all of that. So go ahead.
Edith, please. Sorry, I'll come to teacher.
To respond to Nancy's question, and just to mention that I've seen a trend within the bank where especially the financial sector, which initially was not really focusing on green finance, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, that is increasing. So within our results framework, we are looking at both the supply side, to what extent is there green finance that's coming out of the private sector, but also who is the beneficiary, especially at the SME level, and particularly looking at enterprises that are in the climate space. So that's something that we have in the framework. Secondly is the social sector. Remember, in cases where you have disasters, there's normally social safety nets. To what extent is that money also getting into the hands of those who are in climate vulnerable contexts? So that's something that we've included as well in the results framework. The last thing that I'd like to mention is that we are putting in place what we are calling youth enterprise investment banks, because we've realized that money is not getting into the hands of young people, and that the banks are not tailored for young entrepreneurs. And so these are new banks. The first one was approved in September for Liberia, and we are rolling out a number of them across the African continent, so that there are new institutions that are tailored to provide services directly to SMEs. Great. Financial intermediaries.
Great examples. I do want to also mention to Nancy's point, I think it's just not about the private sector issue. I mean, in ADB, where we largely public sector, the more our colleagues in risk management offices are looking at risk at a portfolio level, of course, they look at the risk, but how do you make sure that risk doesn't end up us deciding we will lend less to the to the Pacific Island countries because they're very high risk? But it should be the other way around, because development bank should be supporting more those countries because that's where the support is required. So I think it's an issue with the public sector also. TJ, sorry, you've been patiently waiting, please. Do you want to put up mic?
Thank you so much, Hago. I think this is actually a very important conversation. The way we see it, particularly with the point that Nancy made, which is also even a challenge, even today with climate finance, that you realize that our project officers would typically prioritize those sectors where they were going to get a lot of climate finance for their investment, which is a challenge. But one of the ways in which we have tried to actually address that is through a prioritization mechanism within the bank. We know certain sectors that would typically give the big numbers, and we know those are the preferred sectors by our climate teams. But then we do know sectors that do, when it comes to being effective, when it comes to climate action, they may not have the big money, they may not have the big numbers that would help them actualize that goal. But then we try to actually create a system in making sure that there is a balance between what is effective. All of them are effective, by the way. The big ones are effective. It's just the fact that they may go to places where the resilience level is much higher and to places that are not as vulnerable as some other places. So we do see that playing a very key role. And that, we normally don't start that at the level of project development, actually. We start those sort of conversation even at the upstream conversation that we do have with the country. So most times it's much more difficult to do that when you do that at the project development stage, when the project is probably just going to the board in the next 2 or 3 months. But then when you do that at the level of the upstream engagement, where you make it clear that part of what you're looking at is also, you're looking at effectiveness of climate action. Not necessarily, the financing is good, the financing is great, they would always prioritize that. But also creating incentives for them to be able, because that's where we generate most of our own impact report. Our impact reports do not come from the big project. They are good for the numbers, but the real impact report, they often come from those smaller projects with very significant impact for climate adaptation. And we've seen that play a very key role. And we anticipate, and going back to the point that you actually made, you mentioned earlier around the fact that looking at outcomes, do we see these playing a role in also discouraging people to want to get those numbers, particularly for those smaller projects? We do not see that happening. We do not see that as something that would, in fact, we see that as an opportunity. It's the reverse, by the way. It's the way we see it from our perspective. So it's something that we're so proud and happy that this is going ahead. And we hope that it's something that MDBs will be able to actually pursue collectively together as we move ahead. Thanks.
Thanks. Since you have the microphone, so what's next for the MDB working group on adaptation on this topic?
That's actually a very interesting, and honestly, that's for me, speaking from ISDB and then as the co-chair, which I've been doing together with Cynthia on this, we feel that these are interesting times because there is a lot of attention on what we're talking about today, which is outcome metrics. But beyond that is the fact that collectively, at the very highest level in our respective institutions, which for those who are quite familiar with the joint statement that we released last week, there is a very strong interest amongst MDBs to work together on this. So, and it's not just for adaptation, but it's also for mitigation as well. So it's a very interesting time for us to have a whole lot of interesting things around outcome metrics. Now, from the perspective of climate adaptation working groups, what are the things that we can expect for the month ahead? As we presented earlier, you saw that there is a lot of things on these that different MDBs have actually been doing. So it's about time now for us to come together to think about, as Cynthia rightly mentioned, which was also presented, how do we take this forward in the sense that do we want to have something as common as the way we have our common principles today, to have something as common as far as outcome metrics is, as MDBs. So this is something that we would be looking into in the coming year around, can we have something together that becomes an approach, while it's not going to be granular to the point that it will be prescriptive to tell each MDB what to do, but it can be very high-level methodological principles that guide on how we look at outcome, whether it's from adaptation perspective, whether it's from mitigation perspective. So this is something that MDBs will be looking at in the years ahead. The second thing that we'll be looking at is around engagement. There are numerous stakeholders earlier this year, I'm already feeling in 2024, sorry. Earlier this year, when we had our adaptation working group meeting in London, we had colleagues from HARIC, the Adaptation Resilience Investment Collaboratives. I hope I got the name right. Yeah. So these are different group of private sector actors that are working on issues around metrics as well. So we do feel that engaging with those different stakeholders, we've had colleagues on the panel today talking about the different work that they do. So for us as MDBs, we do see that this is one of the areas that we want to engage with these different stakeholders externally to look at some of the happenings out there and how those can actually fit into the work that we're doing, but also internally to do a lot of peer-to-peer learning. You heard from different colleagues around what they're doing in their respective institutions. So we'll be looking into this to see how can we work together to be able to learn how things have been done currently in our respective institutions and learn lessons from that to build upon what we're going to collectively bring together as MDBs. And the last point that we'll be looking at is around the place of capacity. I think one important area, when we talk about outcomes is not just about, in the presentation that we made earlier, it's not just about the MDBs. In fact, the bulk of it will come from the countries. The bulk of the results around outcomes will come from the countries, not even from MDBs. We can have our project implementation assessment report. We can have our project completion report. We can have all those things. They're beautiful. But when we're talking about issues around, of course, we can get the output once the project is completed. But when it comes to outcomes and impact, these are medium to long term. And as far as we know, there is still a lot of capacity needed to be enhanced at the level of the country to be able to do this. We can make commitments that we want to track outcomes. Where are you going to track it from? Without the countries having the needed capacity to be able to do that, we do not see that happening. So what is the role that MDBs can play? You heard about the country platform idea that MDBs are beginning, that's country-led platform that MDBs are considering. So these are good opportunity for us to be able to collaborate at the level of the country to also enhance capacity as far as tracking results for our joint investment, joint interventions within the context of the countries where we work. So these are some of the interesting things that we anticipate that we'll be having in the years ahead, and we invite each and every one of you to come along and work with us as we go through this journey. Thank you.
Thanks, TJ, and thanks to you and Cinzia for bringing us till here, and all the best to the new co-chairs, whoever it is. Yes, please, do you have a question? Last question. Keep it. I think there are two questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Timo Leiter. I'm the lead author of the implementation chapter of the Adaptation Gap Report. So we're looking for data all the time, every year, so I feel all the challenges around that. But what I wanted to say is actually focusing on the quality of projects, and it was great to hear from the panel, because there is a risk by striving for simplistic metrics that this could kind of jeopardize the quality of projects. So there's kind of a misunderstanding that you could transfer any project into an adaptation project by adding one indicator from a list. That's not how you get an adaptation project. The quality of the project matters. It needs to address climate risk. So and therefore, the experience from GIZ, Germany's development agency, where I used to work, we had a lot of challenges inside. You know, people had been working for decades in agriculture and water. Then I came in as a junior advisor and wanted to tell them how to do an adaptation project, and they told me, no, we know how to do this. So we really need to build the capacity in our organizations, in your MDBs. The people who work on the development of projects, they need to understand that it's about climate risk. That's much more important than going for metrics. Even so, I understand for institutional logical reasons you have to have these metrics too, but I just wanted to have this message. The quality is what matters. Thank you.
Thank you, team, for highlighting that.
Olga, can I just ask,
please.
because it's a fascinating conversation, really excellent to be having, but I want to bring it back because the question on diagnostics has not come up in this, and I think this is the entry point. And I know there's a whole lot of CCDRs going on with the World Bank, but I think this needs to come. How do we get diagnostics that we're all comfortable to work with? How do we ensure that they are owned by the government, that there is a leadership and an ownership with the government? So when Edith talks about a bridge, you know, in many cases, we don't need a bridge and we don't need any transport infrastructure in a lot of these places because the populations won't be living in a lot of the coastal places in the future. So I think it's that question. I mean, I agree with this point behind me. So it's not about the quality, but it's what are we investing in? And I think how can we get our senior most management behind this over the course of 2024, I would say right up to presidential level, that it is the decisions on what we invest in and that they are part of a resilient pathway is what we should be aiming towards, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Noel. Asmita, very quickly.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I wanted to just build on what TJ said. We have talked a lot about project indicators, right? But how can we actually move from the country perspective?
Yes.
So really looking at what is the baseline, what are the targets that they have, and they can have short-term to medium and long-term target based on the analytical work, for example, CCDR, but also the National Adaptation Plan. And then how do we base our tracking based on that? Yeah,
absolutely. I'm going to go back to just half a second to each panelist. Sorry, half a minute. There are a lot of suggestions on harmonizing approaches for adaptation resilience outcomes. How practical it is and how desirable it is to harmonize these initiatives. Any specific views?
I can
Please start.
Started.
Thank you.
So from a practical perspective, on a high level, it is possible, and I firmly believe that the global goal and adaptation is hopefully going to guide us there. But individual, like the local context is, of course, very context specific. Yep. The details can be kept.
Great. Possible, not possible. Okay, Edith.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, but possible. And I think what's important is for us to look at can we aggregate?
Yep. Okay.
Because that's the big picture that we need to see. And
Aggregation, yes.
and take context into account, but aggregation becomes
It's
very
critical.
Yeah.
Great. Gillian.
I think we've already agreed on principles, and we've done a lot of work together in concert, all of us MDBs at least, and then I know that some of the bilats have a similar conceptual framework together, so I don't see that as a problem. I think it is a bit of a reach for us to all have a common set of indicators, just because I see how difficult that is even within one organization, but maybe striving towards common results areas that we can report out together on. And just quickly in response to this conversation that just happened, I think that we all have collectively a much better understanding of adaptation risks, but I think this is alluding to ideas of transition risks and stranded assets, which I think that conversation isn't as advanced, but there's an overlap with what we're trying to do, and that's definitely something that we have to integrate into our thinking. So, thanks.
Thanks, Julian. Laura.
I think there are certain safeguards that can be thought of and that should serve as a security in terms of how the banks are behaving, but I see a lot of challenges in trying to make it uniform just because there's different mandates, different contexts, different client bases. So yeah, I think that would be my take.
Great. TJ, anything from your points? Sorry.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, I do think harmonization is possible, which is very similar to what everyone said. But application would have to differ on a sector basis, sector by sectorial basis, and also territorial basis. Because we can have high-level principles, but it's just like the way adaptation is. Resilience is even much more complex. That those high-level principles are great. They would help guide what we're working towards. They will help guide in terms of, as we discussed earlier, what are we working towards? What are we building resilience towards? But they will have to consider the peculiarity of different sectors. They will have to consider the peculiarity of different geographies or different territories, which they will have to be applied. So once those are done, I think there is a much higher chance of us achieving the goal that we want to achieve.
Great, thanks. This brings us to the end of the session. I take 3 key takeaways from me at least. One is discussion at a more technical level around metrics indicators. So, resilience for whom, for what, around the attributes of resilience systems, what are some of the common buckets, is built environment, avoided losses, people, etc. That's one sort of work which we clearly need to do. Second is then how do you take that work and embed it in our own institutions, which are quite, I was about to say, whatever, I forget. Yes, it's large institutions with its own, idiosyncrasies in many ways. So we need to then embed that in those systems, specifically the work around corporate results framework, how this reflects there. And Edith talked a lot about learning, and I will be keen to unpack later on some other discussion. How do you really build in learning in an MDB system, which I completely agree is absolutely critical, but I don't know how to crack that. So that's the second bit of work. And the third, the most important, which I take away, is the role that MDBs can play in improving the systems at countries. That is absolutely critical. So whether it's the country platforms, whatever you're talking about, how do we make countries build the system, the right institutions, the right capacity, the right kind of capacity to identify the right projects that's required of financing, right? So unless we build that system, that larger ecosystems, us working just by ourselves will help. So hopefully moving forward, we can, look forward to that direction and really help countries build the system that will ultimately help them understand and achieve resilience outcomes. So with that, thank you so much everybody for attending the session. Great discussion. Thank you. Yes, let's take a photograph. Why not? Yes, everybody, yes. Yes, please.